Welcome back. This is From Battle to Business with your host, Dean Van Dyke. And today I'm fortunate to have Gene Moran, a retired U.S. Navy captain who is also an award-winning defense lobbyist and consultant. Welcome, Gene.
Hey, good to be with you, Dean.
Well, it's great to have you. So in 60 seconds or less, tell us who you are.
Well, today I'm somebody who helps defense companies in Washington, D.C. I help them navigate a very complex process. I'm a father, a grandfather. I love being an entrepreneur, businessman in this phase of life. Prior to this, I was a corporate lobbyist for a while, and I served 24 years on active duty, serving in 6 ships at sea and then also in D.C. And that's where I learned about what I do now.
Well, that's a very interesting background. Of course, I know somewhat of what you did as a captain in the Navy, and so thank you for your service and sacrifice. But one of the things that's kind of a topic today, and I just want to dive into that because it matters to me, and I'm sure it matters to a lot of the audience that we've got too, is but help us understand why the U.S. cares about what's happening in Israel, what's happened back in October, and what's that driving force?
It's a great question, and it's actually pretty complex from my perspective. I've been fortunate enough to travel around the world, as I know you have, at the end of my active duty time. So including all the ship travel, I also ran the Navy Senate office where I did congressional delegations around the world with members of Congress. I've been to over 60 countries. I've seen a lot of different systems. Because I was escorting members of Congress, we were interacting with the ministerial levels of other countries. I feel like I have seen other governments in action. I'm convinced we have the best one around by a wide margin.
I am as well.
I think we're being tested around the world. Israel and Gaza is just one more recent example. As we're recording this now in early December, we're a couple of months into a pretty aggressive fight. It's clear that there are non-state actors at the heart of this, but so too is Iran. And there are other hot spots around the world: China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine, North Korea, things happening in South America. Saudi Arabia seems to be involved with various relationships of interest. I think all of those sort of relationships are tugging at us, us being the U.S., and seeing how we respond. And I believe we have kind of reached a point in the U.S. where we've kind of forgotten about what it took for the world order that we've known for the last 75 years to take hold. And by that, I mean the global sacrifice of World War II and what it produced in terms of stable relationships around the world. I think people miss some of the connective tissue there. And so if this Israel and Gaza conflict were to escalate and the U.S. were to get more involved, or if Russia, Ukraine were to escalate to a degree where the U.S. was more actively involved, I'd say today we're offering funding. We're not truly involved. I think things would look different. Unfortunately, I also think that if we were seriously stressed in multiple directions, readiness cracks would quickly reveal, because our military has suffered from 20 years of war in the Middle East. The clear and documented degradations of readiness are just beneath the surface.
I would wholeheartedly agree on our readiness and our capabilities. My son is currently serving on active duty. I won't go into where and what, but just knowing some of the things that he's experienced, not only when he was in Afghanistan, but then coming back, our current state of readiness is a concern. And I think, with recruiting challenges that we've had, with the equipment challenges we've had, I mean, even in the Navy, I think the Navy's doing, when I was in, standard deployment was 6-7 months. And now I'm seeing 9, 10, and sometimes even 12 months being deployed. So that's a huge strain on families and service members.
And then the flip side of the deployment is that maintenance cycle where ships and submarines are well behind what the standard is. And this is documented by the GAO. It's documented in reports to Congress from the service secretaries within the Department of Defense. It is not a secret within industry that the readiness is being tested in the form of what the industrial base can provide and how to keep up with the depot level maintenance, the heavy maintenance that has to take place periodically. We are in quite a hole that will take years, if not a decade or more, to get out of. And I think that's highly problematic.
No, I would agree. And, on the naval side, when you start extending ships whose life is technically, I won't say expired because they're still, still sailing seas, but when you extend life like that, but then they don't get that depot level maintenance and shipyard maintenance, it's that operational tempo is going to have to suffer at some point.
And the costs associated with typically the Band-Aid approach is the more expensive approach. If you look to the Coast Guard, just as an example, they are forced to run their ships well beyond their expected service life. It is common to see Coast Guard ships over 40 years old. That's not a healthy place to be, and a forward deployed naval force just can't be operating with that sort of weakened capacity.
Well, then, so you mentioned Ukraine and Russia. It seems, based on some of the readings that I'm doing and some of the resistance in Congress, that the funding is running into, and now it seems like the offensive in Ukraine is stalled. Do you see, is there a way out for Congress to resolve that funding issue and to continue funding? Because I even read that, Europe is struggling with funding or continued funding. And without that funding, I don't even want to speculate what could happen.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of aspects to it. One is, what does Ukraine need? And as of, again, mid-December here, early December, we're up to about $100 billion that the U.S. has provided, either in funding so that they can buy from elsewhere, or in material and ammunition that we've provided that we typically are able to pull off the shelf, at least initially. There's a cycle to warfare in that environment, such that there's a winter phase where things are sort of forced to come to a stop, or at least a lull. But if we don't commit adequately, this can just be a prolonged stalemate. There have been successes on Ukraine's part. They have regained territory as of today. They have apparently won the Black Sea part of this fight, and the use of uncrewed surface vessels to help take down naval capacity. But the Army would tell you that, hey, if you want to hold ground, you need to put boots on the ground. And I don't think the U.S. is ready for that today. I'm not sure that we ever will be. I think the Middle East experience has left such a bad taste in the mouths of our citizens that they were sold a bill of goods, and it took 20 years to get out of there. I just don't think we'll rush back in. But the potential impact, if Russia were to take that territory, it affects global grain markets. It affects international trade. It's either oil or gas, or both types of lines are running through parts of that part of the continent that affect economies. And so I struggle to see why the decision is so difficult. In Israel, our closest ally in the Middle East, they've asked for $14 billion as of today, and we can't seem to get a vote on that. I understand how Congress works, and that this is a point of leverage where perhaps the border, something can be done on our southern border. I think we have a border problem on the south side that is decades in the making. And it's not one administration who's responsible for it. It took a long time for it to be this bad. So what Congress will often do is legislate to an end state that's not possible to get to, and rather than just take some incremental wins, moving in the right direction. So right now, the standoff is over this point of leverage, and we're playing with certainly people's lives. If members of Congress had to go live in the circumstances that we're expecting other democratic countries to live in who are suffering like this, I think they would see it differently. But to most Americans, those kinds of global engagements are an abstraction that they don't have close connection to. Part of it's because we have this voluntary military force, the all volunteer force. And so only a very small percentage of the citizenry gets to see this up close. And till there's better awareness, we may make a bad decision to not support in the way that we should, and it will have a poor outcome.
I had one brother in Vietnam, one served during the Vietnam era, and experienced that growing up. And then we had the Persian Gulf War, and then we had 9/11. And I think we've lost, in my opinion, when 9/11 happened, you saw a lot of people pull together and the will to fight was there. But you're right, after 20 years and the way we left, the folks that took power, the Taliban, played the waiting game and ultimately took power again. And I think that that's where folks are either don't want to go back into that situation because is there an end game, right? When the Persian Gulf happened, I believe General Schwarzkopf said, we're not going in until we've got absolutely overwhelming force. And I think we were surprised by there was some resistance, but there was a lack of, I think, the type of resistance we were expecting. And I think that I don't think the US has a stomach for more conflict. So one of the things I know you're well versed in is that nexus of national security, politics, and foreign affairs. How do these all intersect, so to speak? And you touched on a little bit with the grain, the oil, and the gas that flows through Ukraine, but yet a lot of folks aren't aware of that.
Yeah, I think similarly, many are not. Well, they became more aware during COVID. Our international supply lines of trade have been well understood by the Navy and the Merchant Marine for centuries, certainly decades, that so much of our trade passes, by ship around the world. The desire to get to these highly efficient, just-in-time supply chains, through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, they certainly helped drive down costs in the U.S., but we didn't realize the risk that came with that. I think the flip side of that is that today we're talking about we want to onshore all the supply chains. We want everything to be made in America. Well, the reality is we're not able to make everything in America. We have a lot of resources, but we don't have all of the resources. And the reality is that China has a lot of resources, particularly rare earth material. It's so critical to electric vehicle production, battery production, semiconductors. They do have things that we need. So to say that they're the new big enemy, I see that our policy is quite conflicted. We want the low cost goods, but DoD is preparing to go to war by 2027 with China over Taiwan. Personally, I question when that day comes, are we really prepared to defend Taiwan? I know we say we are, and that's our stated national policy, but watching how we're behaving, again, with our closest ally in the Middle East, Israel, and watching how a European democracy is being allowed to suffer for now 2 years, will we jump right in? I'm not convinced. The wargaming suggests that U.S. defense of Taiwan would be quite ugly. We might win in the end, but it'll be with some serious losses that we have not seen since World War II. With an all volunteer force and the disconnectedness of the citizenry from world events, I question it. I watched these behaviors as a part of my work. I advise defense companies on opportunities and what international events might mean to them, where there could be a way for them to provide a solution or help the government save money. That's why I need to be pretty well versed in this to be able to have those sort of ongoing conversations.
I think I do a pretty good job of staying in tune to what's happening in the world because I've like you, I've been to war-torn countries. I've seen the devastation that it causes. And how do you think those of us outside of the military or that have served, I mean, I'll say it, we're so addicted to social media, but yet we don't really truly understand what's going on in the world. How do we change that? I mean, do we change it?
Well, I think we are self-selecting our news sources
Mm.
now in a way that wasn't possible previously. We also didn't know previously to what degree news was being controlled and filtered for us, or curated in a way that it had the effect of filtering it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, traditional journalism has changed. I believe truth has been a casualty of this speed of the movement of information and a continuous demand signal for a news cycle. There's no longer a 24-hour news cycle. It's just constant flow, and
Right.
some of it's correct and some of it's not. When I ask defense leaders, I host executive seminars and what I call a Meet the Ringmasters event, where we bring a dozen defense executives in and I interview a few of them. But when I engage those kind of audiences on what they know about the state of international affairs, most are pretty uncomfortable trying to describe it because
Mm.
they know the contours of it, but they don't feel confident enough to describe it. And I think those are some of the most sophisticated people in our nation who are leading, defense and technology companies. If they don't understand it, there are many, many others who
Mm.
don't. So there's an opportunity there. I participate in a group in my community called the Navy League. I'm sure you're familiar with the Navy League.
Mm-hmm.
They are around the world, but its role is to promote the sea services and help communities better understand what the Navy and Merchant Marine really do. Other services have similar outreach organizations. They're not meant to, co-opt anybody's mind. They're just meant to interpret
Right.
what is the value of having a military service. And I think when you have such a small percentage of the population serving on active duty, that gap of understanding is pretty big.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree. And I think I would welcome the days of Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow to come back and I know that dates me a little bit, but having grown up with that and then watching the evolution of what we call, I think it's more entertainment than news, but so we have an election coming up, national one, and elections, depending on what happens, tends to swing the direction of this country. What do you think is the broad theme of this next national election that's coming up, and what does that mean?
I think the underlying theme is it's time for generational change. And that's not necessarily about age on the part of either the current would appear to be front runner candidates. But I think the population is changing quickly. The younger generation, I'll say between age 20 and 35, have only known a world that seems filled by pretty poor decision making on the international stage, and they want something more. And I think it's right for them to expect something more. And I think they have good heads on their shoulders and have idealism that maybe has not been forged by the reality of international conflicts yet, but their parents and people before them were involved in a corporate lifestyle, or perhaps they were in the military or served overseas in battle. What they've seen in their 20 years of young adulthood, or up, even up to 35 years old, it hasn't been impressive. And at the same time, technology is changing so rapidly and allowing for a better understanding of the world than you or I might have been able to have at that age. Think about reading from the Encyclopedia Britannica and the pre-Google day. I was 40 years old when Google became a thing, and that does date me, but it also gives me perspective on what's evolving. And I think that I heard somebody say this the other day. This is not my line, but I think there's something to it. And they said the first party that lets go of either President Biden or President Trump as their nominee will win this next election. So, of course, there are ideologies that they each are associated with, but I think underpinning that is a need for generational change and just a new way of thinking about where this country should go.
No, I would absolutely agree. I think to reduce that polarization that exists, I think we do need that a different voice. And I think I think we need that pretty desperately because I think there are some, like you said, there's been some decisions that have been made that, my sons have grown up. My son's age range from 24 to I'm gonna probably get this one wrong, 33. But and we have a middle one in between at 27. So yeah, 27 and 34. So, and it's interesting seeing the different dynamics between the 34 and 24-year old. And but I know I think we could talk for a while on this topic, but I want to throw you some very hard questions before we wrap up. And
These weren't hard.
uh, actually, these are probably going to be the easiest questions you've answered so far. But no, it's been I greatly appreciate your perspective, and one of the things that you touched on is just the how intertwined our economies are, and how the lack of grain exports out of Ukraine impacts my father-in-law, who's a farmer in the Midwest. And of course, oil, we could talk about oil for a while, but so one of the easiest questions I'll call it that you're going to answer is, what are the 3 books you'd recommend to my audience and why?
I read a lot of business books, mostly because I'm in the business of advising businesses and business leaders, and I've invested heavily in my own learning to be not just an average consultant, but to be an outstanding expert in my field. And I think that requires just continuous renewal. Sadly, it's a documented fact that most Americans don't read a single book in an entire year. I digest books on audio by Audible. That's my preferred way because I can consume it in a lot of different ways. Driving around or just while I'm doing chores around the house, kind of thing. So for anybody who can process that way, I recommend that as a good way to increase your reading without having to, sit down. And I've never enjoyed laboring through a book by turning a page. Some people love that. It didn't resonate with me. I'll rattle off a couple here that I turn to when I'm advising clients. There's one by Dan Sullivan and Benjamin Hardy called 10x is easier than 2x. And it's about recognizing things in your business where you might spend a lot of time, but it's only producing a 2x result. And if you could strip away some of those overhead sort of chores in your business, you could focus on the 10x things that not only are you really good at, but that produce uncommon, 10 times ROI. Many companies can benefit from a review of those sort of activities. Another book by the same authors, not coincidentally, Dan Sullivan and Benjamin Hardy, is called Who Not How. And that's also about getting your arms around, why are you doing so much on your own? There are many ways that you can offload onerous tasks or things that you just don't need to be doing, whereas somebody else can do it for you. And I joke now that, the best tool in my toolbox is a checkbook. That was not always the case. I didn't have the money to do that. Most on active duty are on a pretty tight budget. But when you get a little bit of discretionary income, you find that you can buy time back. And buying time is actually a great investment. Sometimes it may seem like an expense, but it's really an investment. The last book I'll suggest for anybody who's running a business is called Measure What Matters. And it's by a guy named John Doerr, Doerr. It is about truly figuring out how to measure the performance of your company as aligned to a greater goal. And it's been used by many, many brand names that you all know, but it's a super easy book to read. Each of these books are among the only books that I've read twice. And that's saying something. They are that powerful and can help you that much. Each have a couple of exercises you can do. I don't try to read and digest everything in a book. I try to just take away some key nuggets. And I know if I go through the whole thing, I'll walk away with something more. In each of those, I recognized I want to go back and read them again. And they're just as powerful, if not more so, the second time around. So there's 3 for you.
Yeah, it's interesting when you do that, the nuggets you glean the second time around, and Yeah, I can absolutely agree with that. So where can my audience go to find out more about Gene and the amazing work you're doing?
Well, thanks for that. I have a website, genemoran.com, and it talks about the kind of work I do. I've got a lot of
Mhm.
videos on there. I've got some speaking engagements I've done where I talk about what I do. I'm pretty different in my space of the defense industry, in that I work what I call both sides of the river, the Pentagon and Capitol Hill.
Mhm.
But I understand that process like few others, and I try to describe it in ways on the website so that people can understand that there's a lot of help available, and you don't always have to go in the front door of the government buyer in order to exert influence and to make your sale.
Mm. Well, that's awesome. Well, the one thing I love to do is allow my guests to have the final word. So I will allow you to have the final word.
Dean, I appreciate it. You know, we live in a great country. I think about it a lot, typically to myself though, and I don't have a chance to articulate it to audiences enough. It's something that most people undervalue. The older I get, the more I appreciate what we have and what was done by others for us to have it. When people ask me what advice do I give to defense companies who come to me for help, I say think bigger, because there's so much opportunity in this country, but you just have to reach for it, and don't hold yourself back and take advantage.
Those are some wise words, which I absolutely agree with. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on, Gene, and I can't wait to learn more about what you're doing. And I know you're doing great work in DC. And so thank you very much.
Thanks, Dean. Good to be with you.